an ironic media production.
Visit us at ironickmedia.com.
You have to be careful, too. Just because it progresses doesn't necessarily mean that, oh, they must be having such a difficult time. In other words, your idea about what they might be going through is completely different than what they might be going through.
Very
and
true.
oddly enough, certainly psychologically and emotionally, I'm in so much better shape now than I was when I was 35, even though my CMT certainly has progressed. But I've worked on and realized that CMT is just one part of my life. But this has taken a lot of work on my part to get to that point. So if I was only evaluating my life on how my legs were doing, I would say, oh my God, life sucks. But it doesn't, because I've learned that it's just one aspect. There's so many other things in my life and everybody's life to actually feel grateful about. That's one of the things that I try to work with people, to be able to identify these other areas in their life where they really feel grateful. Gratitude is an incredibly important antidote to depression.
Hello, everyone. This is Chris and Lizzo.
We're a brother-sister team.
And on behalf of the Charcot-Marie Tooth Association, a.k.a. CMTA, we are coming at you.
Coming at you from coast to coast. I live in California, and my brother Chris lives in Vermont.
That's right, Lizzo, the dreary Vermont, the month of November. No leaves on the trees, and I'm really in the dumps. So our next guest may be able to help me out. However,
doubt it.
This is another episode of our podcast named what, Lizzo?
The name of our podcast is CMT for Me. CMT, the number 4, me.
It's a podcast dedicated to those with CMT, their families and friends, giving them a voice in the community to share their incredible stories, successes, challenges, and much, much more.
So, Chris, talking about our friends with CMT, let's talk about the cycle for CMT. We're wrapping it up. Ooh. It's almost all done. We had a fantastic year. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I thought it went really well. It's a 9th annual, right? We conducted that at the end of August. The signature event being in Vermont. And then we had an event in California, one in Wisconsin. We had people from, 30-something states participate. Even someone from England doing a ride. Canada. So the cool thing is, as well, is we raised, I think we're going to be very close to $400,000 this year. $400,000 for CMT research.
Woo. Do you know how much it costs to take a drug to market?
I don't know. I hear numbers like $1 billion, for example.
That's right. $1 billion.
That's a lot.
You know how much $1 billion is?
I sure do.
I don't. Because
let me test you. How many zeros? When you write $1 billion, 9. How many zeros do you write?
9.
Okay.
Yeah,
I was hoping to play
million,
to your weaknesses on the math side. You just totally impressed me.
But 400,000 doesn't seem like a lot, like when you talk about $1 billion. So can you tell me more about that?
I mean, I don't know. I think it is and it isn't. One solution I just thought of, if you just write a check for $999,600,000 and add our 400,000, we're at the billion.
Well, there you go. I'll talk to Gilles when he gets home from his bike ride.
Okay, good.
Well, and whoever wins the Powerball, the 1.5 billion.
Well,
exactly.
David, yes.
They
well,
should
I think
just donate it to the CMTA.
Yeah,
I love
introduce our next guest.
Well, hold on. The money we raise goes towards financing one of our many research projects. And Lizzo, we have over 40 research partners engaged in over 50 research studies at the CMTA, which is pretty cool.
That's amazing.
And when these projects show promise, the partners step in to provide the additional funds to take them to trial. So it is expensive, but it's pretty extensive just in terms of those projects and the researchers backing us up to find a cure for CMT.
So the CMTA doesn't have to come up with $1 billion. We have to fund the essential research, and then the biotech and the pharma companies come in and finance it, right? That's
exactly.
Great. Well said.
So
thank you for that.
It makes me think, though, the lead in on that is anyone listening to the podcast, should you want to donate to the CMTA and help us in this fight to find a cure for CMT, where would they go, Lizzo, and how do they do that?
www.cmtausa.org.
That's awesome. It. Good.
Yeah.
So actually, I was listening to the recent podcast of Jonah, which came out yesterday, which was awesome. And I don't know about you, but do you ever get in this? I'm listening to myself talk and I'm saying like the same words over and over. Like Jonah says something, I just go, cool. You say something, I'm like, oh, that's cool. Something else, I'm like, cool again. or fantastic. And so I got to work on that, right?
Yeah, you know the
Like
other
those
word you say a
repetitive
lot?
words. I'm like, geez,
You know what you say? Phenomenal. Remember
Yeah,
that video? You're like, phenomenal. Somebody
I
interviewed him.
know,
He's like, oh, it's phenomenal. The snow's
I know.
phenomenal. The skis
Yeah.
are phenomenal.
I know. What an idiot. So,
No, it's funny. You're not an idiot.
no, I
Never
know.
say that about yourself. Don't. You're not.
I'm
You're very
actually
smart and
joking
you're
here.
great.
So
I know.
really funny though. But I'm like, man.
I think both of us are influencers. We go, all right.
Yeah.
All right. All right. Or coming at you.
Yeah. Well,
How many times do we say that when we see each other?
a lot. And
Too
I
many.
will say one thing on that. I had a leadership meeting with my team this week. We had 15 of us and we're at dinner, and it's cool because people had been listening to the podcast, and a good friend of mine who works for me, his name is Nathan Sorrell. And he's like, we should do a podcast for Alpha. And he goes, coming at you. And I was like, awesome.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Anyways,
well, let's get
who's
to
our guest, dude?
Our friend. I said my friend in the notes, David, and he's like, hey, wait a minute. It's our friend.
I know.
So our friend
already
David,
being excluded at the intro
at the beginning,
here, so.
my friend, David Tannenbaum. I've known David for quite a long time. He's a psychotherapist in New York. Well, in New Jersey now because he does Skype or Zoom or whatever, but he's been intimately integrated and involved in the CMTA community. He's a treasure trove of information and knowledge and wisdom. Introducing David Tannenbaum. Welcome.
Welcome, David.
Thank you for having me.
You got it.
I say thank you for having me now because I watch all these CNN interviews and the person always has to say, thank you for having me.
Oh, okay.
That's very appropriate.
Well, you may not thank us after this is finished, so.
We'll see.
No,
So
but
David,
it is so great doing the pre-interview here with David, because obviously I see David in the CMTA reports, his column, talked just very briefly probably over the years, but it was just very inspirational. Just David, it was awesome to meet you and just
thank you.
much closer
Thank you.
to you, and it was great. So
I appreciate that.
So David, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in the CMTA.
Well, it's a big question, but I'll try my best to answer it. I think that I was in my mid 40s or late 40s, and my CMT was beginning to progress a bit. And I was going through a rough time, to tell you the truth. Had my anxiety, some depression. I didn't quite know what to do. Ran into a friend of mine in a supermarket in New York City, and he sensed that something was up. And I told him, and he said, well, listen, there's this new thing called the computer. why don't you? I mean, he knew how technologically lame I was. He says, why don't you go on it and find out if there's some support groups, blah, blah, blah. I thought, okay, which I did, found CMT. I was a little scared, to tell you the truth, to reach out because up until that point, I had really been kind of isolated. Interestingly enough, I mean, who knew in New York City, of all places, with 10 million people, I still felt very isolated. I had spoken to no one before that about my CMT. So finding out that there was a support group not too far from me, going there, and it changed my life because it immediately it made me feel less alone. And obviously I could relate to just about what everybody said. And from there, I just became really interested in learning as much as possible about this wonderful community of people. Contacted Elizabeth, and of course, Elizabeth being Elizabeth, she just roped me into doing work for the CMT.
That's great. So you said you were in your late 40s, anxiety, feeling kind of depressed, but I'm trying to think, when were you diagnosed with CMT? Was it at that time or earlier? So just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I was actually diagnosed at 20 years old.
Oh, so you're carrying this around for 20 plus years.
So I was carrying around, but my symptoms were quite mild. So it didn't really interfere with my life. I knew it was there. I knew what it was called. But again, it didn't really interfere with my life. I thought about it all the time. But honestly, there was just really nobody to talk to about it. It's amazing how many things you can kind of keep bottled inside and act like everything is kind of okay. And to tell you the truth, when I started to meet people in the community, for the first time, I realized how alone I really was feeling all those years. It's amazing what you can adjust to. So I adjusted to having CMT as my secret, moved on with my life. But when the CMT started to progress, I realized, okay, I just can't keep this to myself any longer. I need the support. And it's funny as a psychotherapist to probably be one of the last people to figure out I need support.
Yeah. And you had been practicing in this field for how long? By late 40s.
I've been, at that time, I was practicing at least 15 years.
Right. Yeah. It makes me think, even in terms of our mom, I always find that interesting. People that also study in that area. So she would
Right.
coach us when we were growing up, but all of a sudden you listen to her and you're like, well, aren't you practicing the things you taught us? And we're reminding her of what she like, okay, don't be so anxious, mom, or try to work this out or talk through this.
Right. The thing is, like a lot of people, you think you can manage on your own. You have a way of avoiding certain issues that you don't really want to think about.
There are a lot of people in the community that are still isolated, very hesitant to get involved with the community, talk to other people. What benefits did you get from actually getting involved with the support group and talking to other people? Like, what are the pros?
And was that a branch? David, did you go to a branch meeting or
Oh
something?
yeah, I went to a branch meeting. In fact, I went to a branch meeting in Pennsylvania where your office was.
I was at that meeting, right?
Maybe.
I think
I was there.
I did remember you.
Or
Lizzo,
one
I
of
was
those.
there.
You were not there.
Yeah, I was
You weren't
helping,
even born yet.
No, I was.
Well, I was so
engaging.
caught up in my own thing, and I'm surprised I noticed anything or anybody. And by the way, I mean, I was frightened of going to a branch meeting. I was frightened to meet
Why?
other people. I'd kept this bottled up so long. Why? Well, I didn't want to meet people who looked like they were in worse shape than I. I was frightened of what I would see. And I remember walking down the hall of this kind of hospital and hearing people from the branch meeting laughing. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, this can't be the meeting. These people can't be laughing. But sure enough, it was a meeting. And there were like 25, 30 people who were actually having a good time. And in an odd way, that put me at ease. So
Did
I
you
think
see people worse off than yourself? And what did you
Yes, I
think?
mean, there
And
were
how did you
people.
deal with that?
That's a good question. I mean, there were a few people in wheelchairs. Most people were not. Some people with braces, some people with canes, some people walking on their own. It was a whole variety of people who were at different places with their CMT. My fears actually abated once I just got there and saw that these were real people. Honestly, one's fantasy is so much worse than the reality. So I don't know what my fantasy was, but once I got there and showed up and was present, so many of my fears just abated.
You don't have to isolate yourself. There's resources out there. And it's the same thing, Lizzo, when Jonah was speaking about Camp Footprint and these kids all getting together and it's just bonding with similar individuals. And I think that's awesome. You went to the branch and people are laughing. You're like, this can't be the case.
Right. And by the way, your feelings about your CMT or your feelings about whatever issue you have, they're so personal. They're so intimate. So it's a little scary to divulge that stuff. Even to people with CMT, I was still apprehensive because my go-to was just to be silent about it. So this opened up a whole world of where I could be free, even free with my fears. It's amazing that you can adjust to that level of anxiety and adjust to fears and somehow think that it's normal. It's just something that you've lived with for so long. So to go to these meetings and to realize, wait a minute, I'm not alone. Even living in New York City, where I was feeling alone, I'm not alone. Just to even mention the word CMT to me just was a great relief.
So how have you dealt with the progression, the anxiety about progression and the symptoms of CMT? Because I think your point of view can help a lot of people dealing with their own anxiety, their pain, suffering, fears. CMT is a progressive disease, and that's hard because a lot of doctors say, oh, you'll be in a wheelchair by 40, or you'll be this or that. And that's not necessarily true. How do you deal with that, the unknown?
Well, I'll tell you, I didn't do well in dealing with it early on. And I had all sorts of fears, and being sort of very creative in my own mind, I always, of course, went to the worst case scenario. So for me, of course, I was going to be in a wheelchair. I didn't even thought if it was possible, that was going to be me. So when my fears and anxiety really started to get the best of me, I realized that at some point I couldn't live this way any longer. I had to do something.
And how are they getting the best of you? In what way?
Well, I mean, when you walk around feeling anxious and that leads to depression, that's enough. Your anxiety and your depression affects everything about your life. When my CMT started to progress, the fears became even more pronounced. So for me, the way that I began to really work on myself was recognizing, one, I didn't want to live this way. I didn't want to, and by the way, when I say live this way, I don't mean the limitations of CMT. That I could live with, but I couldn't live with the constant anxiety and constant projections of what might happen. So in other words, in some ways it was strange, but in the present, I was okay. But as soon as I started to project in my mind what might happen, that created for me a tremendous amount of anxiety.
Yeah.
So what I did, and this was not an overnight sensation, I realized that I needed to get control of those thoughts. I needed to get control of those out of control thoughts. There was a tremendous amount of noise in my head, lots of noise. And by the way, most of the noise was negative noise. It wasn't good stuff. So what did I do? Well, I got myself into therapy. I got myself into mindfulness training, whatever I could do to quiet the noise in my head. And the best way actually to quiet the noise in my head was to recognize, number one, that there is a lot of noise in your head. That's actually 75% of it. Realize that all that noise is something that you can actually work on and quiet down.
What is that noise? I mean, who's talking to you in your head? Seriously, I have somebody in my head all the time. It has my voice, but I'm like,
I have like 10 in my head right now.
Well, the committee, the committee. Well, that's a good question. Some of the noise comes from your conditioning, your DNA, your family. But honestly, some of the noise is just, this is controversial, but some of the noise are thoughts that actually don't necessarily come from you. They come at you. We can't necessarily prevent the noise coming at you. Once you recognize the noise is there, then you can do something about it. Just your awareness of that there is noise, just that awareness is a way to quiet the intensity.
So how do you train yourself to recognize and become aware? And is that where the mindfulness jumps in? I mean, because I think all those thoughts are there, but you have to be aware of them to do something. So how do you, there must be training involved, right? You got to change your...
Well, it's not that complicated. For example, usually it's your body that registers some kind of tension. So once you're aware that there's tension in your body, then you start a process of just questioning, okay, so where is that? What is that tension? Maybe that tension has to do with a thought that you just had 5 minutes ago. Like, oh my God, I just had a cramp in my leg. What does that mean? So generally there's some kind of origin that leads you to anxiety. So just knowing that noise is simply noise. It's not who you are. It's just noise. It's just, and by the way, most people have noise, but most people just live with the noise their whole lives. They think it's normal.
Lizzo, it's just making me think when we were out in Virginia and you were saying to me, I forgot when, we're driving around in the van and you're like, you need to recognize your triggers, like certain triggers, because I was going off on things. And she's like, it's okay. It's just like, but I'm not thinking about that. It's just kind of like, oh, this is who I am. This is how I respond.
That's right. Just recognizing that there's a lot of chatter, and to recognize most of that chatter is negative, even to actually just name it. Oh, there's my chatter again. And there are those thoughts. That's it. You don't really have to do much after that.
But are there tools to bring your anxiety down? Like you have this chatter, okay, you're noticing the chatter. In the past, I've like gone to something else, but that chatter just kind of follows me. And I try to move to something else. I try to be really busy so that chatter doesn't happen. So are there tools just to go?
First line of defense is always take a breath. Take a breath. We forget how important it is to just breathe. Once you recognize those out of control thoughts, first thing to do, take a breath or several breaths. That slows everything down. Now, people kind of like think it's such a simple throwaway line, but it's actually very, very important. Take a breath. So once you recognize, okay, there's that chatter, you take a breath. If you allow yourself in that moment, you can actually feel the anxiety. It's not, you don't want to, it's not about avoiding these things or about denying these things. Okay, I'm frightened right now. I just had a thought about me in 20 years from now, let's just say. Okay, that's what it is. It's a projection into the future. It takes me away from right here. So once you recognize that it's a projection of some future scenario, you take your breath again and you always come back to the present moment. That's the practice. You recognize the anxiety. If you can name the fear, terrific. then come back to the present moment. You're most
Beautiful.
safe right in the present. And this is this is a lifelong practice. This is
Sure.
not like you do this 20 times and it ends.
It's interesting too. I was just looking at, I have an Apple Watch. An
Right.
Apple Watch has this health, like every once in a while, I look, my watch vibrates and it actually says, take a deep breath. It can sense like when your heart
Right.
rate goes up. So I get
Right.
this notification.
And what
But
do you
that
do when
actually
you
helps
get
me to
that?
think about that.
What do you do when you get that notification, Chris?
I just take the watch off. I'm like, oh, this watch isn't working. It's crazy. I'm fine.
There you go.
Throw this watch on the ground, stomp on it. That's what it
Stamp
does.
on it.
Right.
Annoying watch telling you to take a
Right.
breath.
No, but and it does this component like David just referenced. There's this reminder about practicing mindfulness and
Right.
breathing. It comes across on my watch. I'm serious. And does meditation play a role for you, David?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I didn't really, it wasn't until about 3-4 years ago that I actually started a more formal meditation practice. It absolutely does help. Just spending that 15-20 minutes in the morning or 15-20 minutes in the evening, just recognizing or seeing the chatter, just watching it come in and come out, breathing. That's all that's needed, just to observe the thoughts, observe the feelings. Now, in formal meditation, you're doing it for 20 minutes straight, but just that 20 minutes, morning and evening, actually builds a kind of a muscle. It builds a muscle. So during the day, it becomes a lot easier to be aware and mindful of these thoughts.
Previous to 2 years ago, I think if somebody told me to sit still for 20 minutes every day, I'd rather stick needles in my eye.
I know.
I
Right.
agree. That just
And
seems
that's
like
by
a
the
long
way-
It's like, I don't
time.
want to do that. What a waste of
Yeah,
time.
of not doing anything for 20 minutes.
And that's not uncommon. I always tell patients of mine, don't beat yourself up if you can't do it. Do it for 5 minutes. Do it for
Right.
3 minutes. You can handle 3 minutes.
Black and white thinking is something that I have. So it's either
That's right.
this or this, but the 3 minutes is a good intermediary kind of gray zone.
Exactly. And again, meditation is not so much about a sitting practice. Meditation is a state of mind. You can be mindful in watching your thoughts and feelings throughout the day. The idea is to just simply observe. Don't judge. Don't criticize yourself. Just observe them.
But Chris would say, and I'm going to put words into your mouth because you said something like, who has time to be thinking about that all
Right.
day long?
I don't
Like
wanna
all
go
that
down
stuff.
that
Like
path.
I don't
You
have
get too
time to
much
be
time.
thinking about my mind and my chatter. And
Well, here's the thing. So you have a choice. You can say, well, I don't have time to do any of that. Or do I have time to feel anxious and depressed? It's like you make a choice. If anxiety and depression and fearful thinking really bothers you, then you'll do something about it.
Yeah,
Right.
you're reminding me of this individual coach who I've hired for our business. And I remember when I first got to know him, I referenced or made some comment like, oh, I don't have time. And he's like, wait a minute. You do have time. You just choose not to spend it that way.
Absolutely.
And he was absolutely right. I made that
Right.
decision. I always think of meditation is you're sitting there with your legs crossed in a room, but it doesn't have to be that way, like you said. And Lizzo,
Right.
something over like the last a year and a half is every morning I stretch. And I'll go
Right.
outside, even in the winter, and just stretch before I get anything else going. And actually, I practice some of that breathing, and I'm just kind of clearing my mind and observing the outside. And that's something I've never done before, but I'm pretty religious about it. And it takes me 10, 15 minutes.
That's great. And most people don't realize that one of the resistances to meditation is that they don't want to be alone with their thoughts.
Hmm.
Most people don't want to hear their thoughts. They're frightened of their thoughts. So that's why people keep themselves very, very busy. And what I say to is your thoughts are just your thoughts. They're not real. So you can have thoughts, just don't become your thoughts. You can have thoughts, but you don't have to identify with your thoughts. And the more you are aware of these specific thoughts or feelings, that creates a little bit of distance. So you're watching the thoughts. Again, you're not becoming your thoughts. And that makes all the difference in the world from being unconscious about your thoughts to being conscious. The more conscious you are about your thoughts, the thoughts quiet down on their own.
that's interesting. And that is
Yeah.
so true. It's so true.
Yeah.
The way you said that explanation was so great. I mean, it's so
This is like free
descriptive.
counseling. I hope he doesn't charge us.
Well, yeah, you'll get
after
the
this.
bill
As
later.
an
I've
hour,
learned that
I'll
with
get the
David.
bill. Yeah, is that what he does?
Yeah, he just ascends it and then just go, well, I got to pay it because I want him to stay with the CMTA.
Just pay
community.
it.
What's this leaf blower story here I have in my notes?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I have this really crazy neighbor who is like obsessed with his leaf blower. I do think there's a little OCD there. Like a leaf falls, and I see him out there with his leaf blower. Anyway, when this started, when he moved in about 4 or 5 years ago, and me, one of the things I prize more than anything in the world is quiet. It's quiet. So here I have this neighbor who's like using the leaf blower, and I'm not exaggerating. Daily, summer, winter, spring, fall.
Okay.
The only thing that stops him are blizzards. Maybe he won't do it when there's a blizzard, but it was terribly annoying. And really, it was impacting me so that it was like I spent far too much time thinking about this. And every time I would begin to hear that noise, my body would tense up. When I started to meditate, after I would say about 6, 7 months, I noticed that the leaf blower was on, but I wasn't reacting as quickly. I wasn't reacting as strongly.
So at the beginning, you'd be like, that leaf blower.
Oh my God, I was going to kill the guy.
Yeah.
I just had this fantasy that we were going to fight. I was going to hit him with my cane,
Yeah.
Unfortunately, he's not a big guy, so I think I can take this guy.
You can take him. Yeah.
But I'm not proud of the thoughts that I had.
No, we all have those thoughts.
But I noticed that the more I just became mindful of my thoughts and watched my thoughts, all my reactions started to slow down. And that's the big benefit of meditation. Your reactions, they just slow down. So I became a lot less impulsive. You know what I'm saying? Impulsive. And I know that I was very impulsive. Something happens and I react. With the quieting of the mind, okay, it's there. It's still annoying, don't get me wrong, but the level of annoyance went down tenfold.
So, David, do you have some clients that actually have CMT?
I do, sure.
And so it kind of feeds into, I think, a question you had, right? At one point was, are there some common themes that you find some individuals with CMT come to you with, or is it just general, like very common regardless?
Well, listen, I don't even have to, I just can use my own experiences with CMT.
Sure.
So I don't even have to go out of my own internal psyche. Listen, I think there is a understandable depression that sometimes accompanies any kind of ongoing condition. Depression is normal. I'm not saying that there's not anything that you can do about it, but it's absolutely normal. And I think a lot of people are hesitant to get help because they don't even want to acknowledge that they're depressed. And it's amazing that people can live with a low level of depression and think it's okay. I would say one of the common issues around CMT is depression, which is understandable. But I think what I find more debilitating than the depression is the anxiety, is the fears. And by the way, it's hard sometimes to tell anxiety and depression, it goes back and forth. If you're very, very anxious, you're going to feel depressed. But the projections into the future are probably the most common issue that I think people with CMT, at least in my practice, have. The worry, the worst case scenario thing. Depending on when you get CMT, because I think it's very different when young people have it as opposed to older people who are diagnosed in their 50s and 60s. I think it affects, for younger people, particularly it affects your self-esteem. So it's like a 25-year-old is going to react very differently than a 65-year-old. 25 is at the beginning of his or her life. There's dating involved. There's wanting to be okay for their career. So there are a lot of big questions. And with dealing with CMT, it puts the spotlight on how you feel about yourself. And if you're looking at your CMT and thinking, well, listen, I have CMT, so, my life's over, or people are going to make fun of me, or I'm not going to be able to wear this lovely dress, or all that stuff. Those are real issues. And to have someone actually to talk to about it, for someone to say, I get it, I understand. But let's look at other ways to help you feel good about who you are. And the problem is in CMT, when you have CMT, you're often identifying yourself with someone with CMT as opposed to a human being who happens to have CMT.
So true. I have a question for you. Can I get a little counseling here, please?
Well, okay. I'm on the
You'll
clock.
try. I know I'm a tough one. You refuse me in your practice, but that's okay. I feel kind of selfish asking this question, but I have a lot of people that I've known, and so does Chris, in the CMT community that I really care a lot about. I've become very close to. lots of people, and I have this huge heart and admiration for people living with CMT. I've been involved for 20 years. I get really upset when I see the progression year to year to year. And it becomes, I mean, I'm not going to say it's too much, but it's starting to affect me psychologically. And I can
Sure.
only imagine, my son has CMT. Parents must feel this way. You go back and forth saying, we're lucky for this. And then you go, oh, this. I know it's like the human condition, but it really bums me out, this disease. And I'm not sure how to continue on with as much enthusiasm because
Yeah.
it's heartbreaking to me.
Well, listen, it's understandable, Elizabeth. I mean, your own child has CMT, so it's not like you're removed from it. You're a mom, so the last thing you want is as a child of yours to suffer in any way, shape, or form. It's understandable. It's understandable. And just as I might need support around this, so does everyone. So does every family member, particularly a family member who is worried about their child. So I get it. I get it. The thing is, when you're looking at someone who has maybe progressed, like, for example, I mean, I've certainly progressed in the last 10 years since I've known you, or 15 years since I've known you. You need to look at, okay, so what does that mean for you that someone is having a little bit more limitation? What does it mean? Where do you go in your head?
Yeah, the problem is I can't fix it. That's it.
You can't.
I
Okay,
can't fix
so
it. That's
see,
it.
you identified something very, very easily. You can't fix it, but you have to be careful too. Just because it progresses doesn't necessarily mean that, oh, they must be having such a difficult time. In other words, your idea about what they might be going through is completely different than what they might be going through.
Very
And
true.
oddly enough,
Yeah.
I'm in a lot, certainly psychologically and emotionally, I'm in so much better shape now than I was when I was 35. I mean, I'm much happier now, even though my CMT certainly has progressed, but I've worked on and realized that CMT is just one part of my life. But this has taken a lot of work on my part to get to that point. So if I was only evaluating my life on how my legs were doing, I would say, oh my God, life sucks. But it doesn't, because I've learned that it's just one part, one aspect. There's so many other things in my life and everybody's life to actually feel grateful about. So that's one of the things that I try to work with people to be able to identify these other areas in their life where they really feel grateful. Gratitude is an incredibly important antidote to depression.
Great. Do you feel like Russ supports you in your CMT? Russ, your partner, does he
Yeah,
get
absolutely.
it?
I mean, he's amazing. Just to have someone who is patient and allows me to complain, which I do, is incredibly nurturing. I remember years ago, one of the ways that I'm reminded that he's such an amazing guy is that when we're walking together on a street, he's learned to kind of look down to warn me of any bumps
Yeah.
or cracks in the road. He just does that instinctively. And honestly, for me, I love that somebody is like, has my back. Somebody is
Yeah.
really out looking to protect me. And that's great.
Yeah. And that's,
Many
that's great.
people are really afraid of relationships or even looking for relationships because they're going to feel rejected or they'll be rejected because of their physical differences.
Absolutely. And I have to tell you, I mean, I deal with people all day long who have the same fears of rejection, and they're perfectly healthy people. I mean, a patient I saw this morning, he was frightened of rejection because his hair is thinning as a 30-year-old guy. And let me tell you, he's a lot more hysterical about his hair being thinning than some of my CMT people who are
Right.
afraid of like not being able to walk.
Yeah.
Don't you feel like saying sometimes, like, dude, get over it. Just get some hair plugs or something.
I do. I do. Although now I've tried to like control myself, but I do.
Yeah.
But I
So,
realize that, so everybody has their own, whether
yeah.
it's his thinning hair or my worries about my inability to walk. It's basically the same thing. It's fear.
Yeah. But how did you end up in this profession? Like, what drove you to do what you're doing today? And is there a history there?
Well, yeah. I mean, I realized that. Look, I knew from a early on that I was not a businessman. I think I probably knew early on that I wanted to do something to help others. And honestly, having my own, being diagnosed at a relatively young age, I thought, let me if I was just going to focus on myself, I would probably be miserable. But focusing on someone else and helping others was actually a way to help myself. So it wasn't exactly a self pursuit. It was really a way of like, okay, if I'm going to feel better about myself, I want to find something that's purposeful and meaningful. And honestly, I think because of my own CMT, I had a kind of a natural empathy that I knew what suffering was about. And I think patients of mine could probably sense that I was sensitive to people suffering.
Yeah.
And again, Elizabeth, you had asked me something about the difference between pain and suffering.
Yes, you have something on your website. It's a beautiful website. What is the website name?
It's just David Tannenbaum Therapy.
Yeah, David Tannenbaum Therapy. Yeah, something about pain and suffering. What's the difference?
Yeah, I mean, very important distinction. Pain is really about the physical sensation of what we go through, the physical sensation of pain, the aches and pains that we experience. But suffering is really how you handle the pain, how your attitude about the pain, your emotional response to the pain. And to tell you the truth, most people can handle the pain. They cannot handle the suffering around their emotional upset around.
Do you think the suffering augments the pain?
Absolutely. I mean, there hasn't been a great research around that, but wouldn't it make sense? And wouldn't it make absolute sense? And I know that for myself, that if I'm anxious about something, well, just think about it. If you're anxious, that anxiety is going to be experienced in your muscles.
Of course.
Yeah.
You know, this is not rocket science.
Yeah.
You know, and I knew from my own experience that before I put an addition on my house, I had to go up all these stairs to get to the second floor. And let me tell you, when I was anxious or upset or depressed about something, anything, my ability to go up those stairs was really affected. It was like clockwork. But yet when I was okay, when I was feeling good, guess what? I went right up those stairs.
Really
so that was such a clear indication to me that your mind affects your body and your body affects your mind.
Listen, I just went on the website here and just to our listeners too, right? So it's David Tannenbaum, Tannenbaum therapy.com. And there's some really cool articles on there, David. That's great.
Oh, good. Good. Thank you.
So just want to share those with our listeners today.
Sure.
So I'm going to ask you a question that you probably won't be expecting.
Oh, boy.
Now his anxiety is rising.
Go meditate for a little bit here.
I'll give you a second to compose yourself. No, I'm just wondering if you were going to write a book, and maybe you have already, what would the title be and what would it be about?
I think it would be about not just finding joy, not in spite of your limitations, but because of your limitations.
I like that.
Yeah.
It's a lifelong journey.
It's a lifelong journey. And this is a journey. It's a good word. I mean, this is not something, okay, if you're diagnosed, that's it, and you deal with it. It affects your entire life for your whole life. And I try to convey a kind of optimism because I think we get better as we get older. We get better at dealing with all these difficult parts of who we are. We get better.
That's true. And I'm just thinking about myself. We're getting better, but we're getting older. And I don't like getting older, but I do like getting better. So I'm not sure how to deal with that.
Yeah, it's not a great balance, is it?
It's hard to balance the older,
it's hard to
better
balance
thing.
that. But I do think about your experience, the life you live, and having CMT and your profession, thinking about all the listeners out there listening to this podcast. Is there something you'd like to leave them with, some words of wisdom and or something insightful that you'd like to share?
I know. Kind of like it has to be insightful. Why?
Yeah, just easy.
Well, I don't know how insightful it is, but having CMT is about you have challenges in your life. It's a difficult life, but it absolutely can be a good life. And people forget that just because you have challenges doesn't mean that you can't have a great life. And I think that needs to be really imprinted in people's heads, minds from a very early age, because we're so accustomed to thinking, okay, if I have some condition or limitation, that's it. That means I'm not going to have a good life. No, it means that, yes, you have to deal with some tough stuff, but in the dealing with this tough stuff, it actually opens up other things in your life. It helps you deal with other things in your life a lot easier. So don't see it as a curse. I'm not going to be Pollyannish and say, oh, great, it's a gift. But in a sense, it's the one thing that will push you forward in your life. Everybody has something, some big challenge. Mm-hmm. So for me and for other CMTers, having CMT, okay, that's their challenge, but that's also what's going to propel them.
Some people are just, I feel like, and I was wondering why, are just innately positive. And have they made that choice along the way, and others just can't get there? It's so much harder to look at the positive side than the negative side. Is that just of attitude? Is that how we were raised? A little bit of both, nature, nurture?
That's a good question. I think some people have generally a higher set point on positivity. And I must, in full disclosure, I'm not one of those people. You know,
Yeah.
I'm a whining Jewish guy from New York. So I complain about a lot of things. So I don't think you have to generally be an inherently positive person, but I do think that you have to get really fed up with your feeling negative to say, okay, enough with that. I got to work on myself to feel more positive.
Yeah. And I mean, I feel, and I've said this before, I think sometimes you have to hit a low that really will propel you forward.
Absolutely.
Right? And not only CMT, but in a lot of different things. And what I find is that it is very common. People that have a disability, or just for this podcast, focusing on CMT, I think everyone we've spoken to, Elizabeth, has had kind of that low. And you're talking to them and I'm like, my gosh, they are so positive, but they have gone through some challenging times and have come out better as a result of it. And they're very...
We lost
Chris.
Him. Yeah, he'll call back in. Amazing interview. I love this interview.
Thank you.
I mean, it's just so genuine. And thank you for being so vulnerable and authentic.
My pleasure, Elizabeth. Anytime.
We have to wait for Chris to come back.
Okay.
I don't know what happened. He probably hit a button or something.
Well, I think he was saying something about you have to go low. You know, you have to really feel the pain, which is so true. And some people, unfortunately, you know, you feel the pain and they just contract. They just turn inward and, you know, they just close down. Other people they use their pain to say, okay, enough already. I don't want to feel this way. What can I do to feel better?
Right. And, you know, when you were talking about emotions and feelings and thoughts, I've only recently learned to accept the emotions instead of just trying to get rid of them. Who wants to feel sad? But you got to feel it to be able to get rid of it.
Exactly. That's a very important, what you just said, Elizabeth, is terribly important. You have to feel it to let go of it.
Right.
You can't deny it. You can't go over it. You have to go through it. And
that's it was a hard concept for me.
Yeah. Whether it's accepting CMT or accepting anything else that's difficult doesn't mean that you're resigning yourself. Has nothing to do with that. It's just accepting brings a certain kind of peace. And then you can actually do your real work with a foundation of peace.
Chris, before you got cut off, you were saying something about hitting a low.
Yeah. And I just want to say to our listeners here, so I was in mid-sentence and it just made me think that I also need a lot more time with someone like David, because I'm just talking and the battery just dies in my computer. And I'm just like, you should have heard my response. I'm in this room. I was like, oh my God, my watch was going off. Take a deep breath, calm down. I'm like, but seriously, that's what happened. I'm like, oh my God, how do I control it? I was so frustrated, but I did take a deep breath, which is good.
Good.
Maybe that's success. I'm moving in the right direction, listeners. Perfect. All right. Give me a round of applause. Yes, I was stating, and maybe I made my point. I can't recall, but
well, I think Elizabeth and I said we were talking about sometimes the lows is what propels you.
Yeah,
and I always remember something. I always remember a quote. It's a very famous Nietzsche quote: "Whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger." And I think that's a perfect way to look at any difficult condition one has.
Well, David, this is fantastic. There I go. Fantastic. Of course, I'm going to keep saying that. But no, so great. So great. And I'm so glad. Even myself, Lizzo, it made me think there is support out there, whether someone picks the phone up and speaks to David or someone else, or they go to a branch. And there's people out there. So you don't have to do this on your own. You just don't. Right. And I think that's great in terms of these branches and other folks that the CMTA has brought together. And that's part of our mission, providing support for those and helping them navigate through this, and they can carry on their experiences to others, which is a big part of our podcast. So
Amen.
And I want to thank
Amen.
you, David, for being
Yeah,
such a big
totally.
part of the CMTA community.
Oh, my pleasure.
You've made such a difference in so many lives, including my
Thank
own.
you so much, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Well, to be continued.
Before we end, I just have a joke.
Yeah.
I have a
geez.
joke.
Oh gosh.
I thought
Get
this
ready,
was funny.
folks.
Okay, remember this one, David. It's not a Nietzsche quote.
We're going like way low on this one. So
How many psychotherapists does it take to change a light bulb?
I have no idea, Lizzo. I don't know.
Just one, but the light bulb really has to want to change.
That's an oldie but goodie.
Yeah.
Okay, wait, I got one, Lizzo.
Yeah, okay.
Wait, I got one. How many social workers does it take to change a light bulb? Anybody?
No.
Okay. None. It takes none. They set up a team to write a paper on coping with darkness.
There's so many. Like, that's funny.
Oh, really? Don't kill my shield.
I think we'll stop there. I think David really has all the answers.
All right, Lizzo, wrap it up, girl.
All right.
Okay.
Well, to our listeners, do you have a good story? Would you like to be on our CMT for Me podcast? Well, if you do, send us an email and write to cmtformepodcast@gmail.com. Tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us why you'd like to be on the podcast, and we'll reach out to you.
That's cool.
Perfect.
And Lizzo, really important. You and I are pushing this all the time. It'd be awesome to have people write a review of our podcast. So how do they do that?
Well, I've asked a couple of people to write reviews of our podcast on Apple, and it's a little bit tough to find the review section. So if you can't figure that one out, put one on Spotify. Spotify also accepts reviews.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing people ask me, they're like, why should I write a review? What's it going to do? What's the value of a review?
Well, it's getting more listeners, more awareness, more people to listen to the podcast, and more people to be enlightened. I mean, this is such a great podcast that we had today. I want everyone to listen to it. So much value in it.
That's cool, Lizzo. You know, it made me think as well. So Lizzo and I have talked about, like, where do we go with this podcast? And we've had this, I don't know, I have this idea, like maybe we take this out on the road next year or in 2024 and really kind of be like Al Roker goes around in his van and does the weather. Maybe we'll tour the United States and do a podcast and interview folks and do a component of a cycle event. Who knows?
Who knows?
Who knows? Well, Lizzo,
Sky's the
listen,
limit.
you
Sky
got it.
is
That's
the limit.
it.
That's right.
That is it. Well, Lizzo, have a great day, sis. I got to get going. And to all of our listeners, next time, folks,
join us.
Thank
and thank you
guys.
so much, David. You're awesome.
My
I think the
pleasure.
title of this is going to be Everybody Loves David.
yes. And we'll just use my words, fantastic, awesome, phenomenal.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
All right, see ya. Thanks a
talk.
lot.